I remember the exact moment when my entire world turned upside down. It was a Wednesday morning, the kind of morning that feels heavy with rain even if the sky is clear. My name's Alex Carter, and for the last 7 years, I'd been working at a mid-sized marketing agency in the city. I wasn't just another employee. I was the guy who worked late, who covered for everyone else, who never said no when the boss asked for more. My work was my pride, my anchor in a life that felt increasingly adrift. I'd spent countless nights perfecting campaigns that had turned our little agency into a name clients trusted. I'd given up weekends, birthdays, anniversaries all for this job. I thought I was building something that would last, that it would mean something. So, when my boss, David, called me into his office that morning, I didn't expect the earth to shift beneath my feet. He was sitting there in his polished leather chair, scrolling through his phone like I was an afterthought. His expression was unreadable. I remember thinking maybe I'd finally get that promotion I'd been hinting at. My hands were shaking, a little from the coffee I'd slammed down, but my mind was steady, focused. "Alex, we're going to have to let you go," David said, his voice smooth and indifferent. Just like that. No warning, no explanation. I blinked, my mouth going dry. "What? I don't understand." "My last project exceeded every target I've been putting in," he cut me off with a wave of his hand, not even bothering to look up from his phone. "It's not about your performance. We just think it's time to go in a different direction. You're replaceable." That word replaceable hit me like a slap. My heart stuttered, then thundered. I felt the air leave my lungs, replaced by a cold, hollow ache that settled in my chest. I tried to argue, to make him see reason. "David, I've been here 7 years. I've brought in more clients than anyone else. This isn't fair." He finally looked at me then, his eyes flat and bored. "Life's not fair, Alex. You're good, but good isn't enough anymore." I felt like the ground had opened up and swallowed me whole. The office I'd spent years working in suddenly felt like a stranger's place. My shoulders slumped, my hands trembled, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely powerless. David leaned back, his smile a thin cold line. "You'll have HR walk you out. Leave your badge on the desk." I stood there, numb and shaking, as he turned back to his phone. Already moving on to the next meeting, the next project, the next disposable person. As I walked out of his office, I felt a mix of shame and fury bubbling up inside me. My mind was screaming for answers, but my body just kept moving, like I was on autopilot. I didn't even notice the tears welling up until they started to fall, hot and bitter. I'd given them everything. And in one breath, they told me I was nothing. I didn't sleep that night. My mind was a chaotic swirl of anger, confusion, and disbelief. I lay there in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of my small apartment, feeling like everything I'd built had vanished in the blink of an eye. My phone was buzzing with messages from friends who'd already heard the news industry gossip. Travel's fast, but I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain. I just wanted to understand why. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, replaying David's words over and over. "You're replaceable." The more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I knew it wasn't about my performance. David said as much. So what was it really about? I tried to tell myself to let it go, to start fresh somewhere else, but there was something about the way he'd said it, so casual and dismissive, that didn't sit right. My gut was telling me there was more to this, that it wasn't just a random layoff. I spent the day pacing my apartment, flicking through my old work emails on my laptop. It was like going through a photo album of my past pitches I'd stayed up all night for. Presentations that had brought in million-dollar clients. My eyes stung with each memory, each reminder of how much I'd poured into that job. I opened my old files, half hoping to find some small clue, some thread I could pull on. I told myself it was pointless. What would I even find? But I couldn't stop. It was like an itch under my skin that wouldn't go away. That's when I noticed it. An email from a client I'd secured just a few months back, a huge deal, the kind that kept the lights on for everyone. I remembered the meeting vividly. I'd spent weeks nurturing that relationship, crafting a proposal that was airtight. But this email wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to a junior associate who'd barely been in the room during those meetings. I scrolled down, my heart racing. The client was thanking the associate for his leadership and direction, crediting him for the success of the project. My jaw tightened. That had been my work, my late nights, my weekends, and here it was, rewritten as someone else's victory. My pulse pounded in my ears. I started digging deeper, pulling up every project I'd worked on in the last year. I found more of the same emails, memos, client notes that had my name scrubbed from them. My work, my ideas, all attributed to someone else. I felt sick. I tried to tell myself it was just a clerical error, a simple mix-up. But the pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. My chest felt tight as I read message after message that erased me from the narrative. I closed my laptop, my hands shaking. My thoughts were a tangle of fear and fury. David hadn't just fired me. He'd rewritten history, cut me out of my own work. And if he'd done that, what else had he done? I needed answers, but I couldn't just march back into that office demanding them. I still had friends. They're people who'd whispered their support in passing texts, and I started reaching out quietly, carefully. I met up with Rachel, one of the senior designers, at a small cafe near our old office. She looked around nervously as she sat down, her eyes darting to the door like she was afraid someone would see us. "Rachel," I said, my voice low and urgent, "I need to know what's going on. David said I was replaceable, but there's more, isn't there?" She hesitated, stirring her coffee like she was trying to find the right words. "Alex, I don't know everything, but there have been rumors. David's been talking to a new investor, someone with deep pockets who's pushing for a rebrand. They want fresh blood, someone younger, cheaper." I swallowed hard. "So that's it, I'm just collateral damage." She shook her head. "It's not just that. I've seen emails. Alex, they're rewriting your work to fit this new investor's vision. They're erasing you from the client lists so they can sell this narrative that the agency's always been about the new team. It's like you never existed." The words felt like knives. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks for telling me, Rachel. I won't drag you into this any more than I already have." As I walked back to my apartment that evening, the city felt colder, the lights harsher. My head was spinning. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't just a job. It was my identity, my years of work, my reputation, and they were wiping it all away. I couldn't prove it yet, not fully, but I knew what I felt in my bones. I was being erased, and I couldn't let that happen. The next few days were a blur of half-sleep and frantic energy. I was living off coffee and adrenaline, my mind racing with questions and half-formed plans. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's bored expression, heard his smug voice telling me I was replaceable. It burned in my chest like a fever. I knew I couldn't just confront him, not yet. I needed something concrete, something he couldn't brush aside or spin into another lie. I needed proof. I started by combing through every document I still had access to. My personal backups were a goldmine of old presentations and proposals, some of them still marked with my name in the metadata. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. I needed to see what was happening inside the agency, now the real story behind my dismissal. Reached out to Mark, one of the IT guys who'd always been a little too fond of bending the rules. We'd shared more than a few late-night beers after office parties, talking about everything from work to failed relationships. I hoped he still saw me as a friend. We met up in a dingy bar on the edge of the city. Mark looked around nervously. As he slid into the booth across from me, his voice low. "Alex, this is risky. You know that, right?" "I know," I said, "but I need to see the files. I need to know what they're hiding." He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "I've heard things, man. They're wiping your name off everything. It's not just you. They're setting up this whole new narrative for the agency like none of the old guard mattered." I clenched my jaw. "Can you help me, Mark? Just give me access to the shared drive, anything that mentions me or my projects." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, I can get you temporary access, but you've got to be careful. If they trace it back to me." "They won't, I promised. I'll be careful." That night, I sat in the glow of my laptop screen, my heart pounding. Mark had sent me a secure link, one that bypassed the usual security. As I dug through the folders, I felt like a ghost haunting the office I'd once called home. What I found made my blood run cold. There were emails between David and the new investor, detailing how they planned to refresh the agency's image. My name came up again and again, not as a valued asset, but as a liability. "Alex's style is too traditional." One email read, "We need younger voices. Edgier campaigns." In another thread, I saw a spreadsheet of upcoming projects, but the credits had been changed. My work, my designs, stripped of my name and reassigned to junior staff who'd barely touched them. They were rewriting history in real time, but the worst was a set of financial records. I almost didn't believe what I was seeing. Payments, listed under my projects, but with padded expenses and suspicious vendor invoices. Shell companies, money that should have gone to the agency, funneled somewhere else. My projects used as a front for siphoning off funds. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all pressing down on me. It wasn't just betrayal, it was fraud. They were using my work, my sweat and sacrifice, as a smokescreen for their scheme. I took screenshots of everything, every email, every invoice. My hands were shaking, but my mind was crystal clear. I wasn't going to be a footnote in their dirty little story. The next day, I reached out to a few of the older team members, people I trusted, people who'd been there in the trenches with me. I met Sarah in a quiet park at dusk, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth after a brief rain. She looked tired, her eyes lined with worry. "Sarah, I know this is dangerous," I said quietly, "but I have proof. They're stealing from the agency, from all of us." She sucked in a breath. "You're sure?" I showed her the screenshots on my phone, the evidence as undeniable as the tremor in my voice. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," she said. "I'm in." I could see the fear in her eyes, but also something else, a flicker of defiance. We weren't just colleagues anymore. We were allies. In the days that followed, I gathered everything I could. I became meticulous, methodical. I set up encrypted drives, password-protected folders. I backed up everything 3 times over. I wasn't going to let them erase me or bury the truth. But even as I moved with growing purpose, the emotional toll was relentless. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was unraveling. I'd spent so long, being loyal, believing that if I just worked hard enough, I'd be valued. Now I saw how naive that was. Still, that anger, that deep gnawing sense of injustice, it gave me strength. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was becoming something. Sharper, more focused. Every piece of evidence I found, every ally I pulled in, felt like a small victory against the tide of betrayal, and I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. I wasn't going to let them bury me. I was going to fight back, and I was going to win. I stood outside the agency's glass doors, the early morning sun painting the sky in bruised streaks of pink and purple. My heart was a drum in my chest, steady and insistent. Today was the day. No more hiding in the shadows. No more letting them decide my worth. I walked in, head high, the cool air of the lobby biting against my skin. The receptionist looked up, startled, but I didn't slow down. My hands were sweaty, but my grip on the folder I carried was ironclad. It was everything, every email, every invoice, every dirty secret David had buried. The office was already buzzing, people milling about with coffee cups and forced smiles. They watched me as I strode through, a hush falling in my wake. They knew something was coming. They could feel it. David was in his glass-walled office, backlit by the city skyline. Like some kind of corporate deity, he looked up when I knocked, his expression flickering from surprise to annoyance. "Alex," he said, leaning back in his chair, his voice smooth as ever. "What are you doing here?" I closed the door behind me, my pulse roaring in my ears. "We need to talk." He gave me a patronizing smile, like I was a child who'd wandered in during a grown-up meeting. "I don't think there's anything left to say." "Oh, I think there is," I said, my voice low and calm. I laid the folder down on his desk, the papers inside fanning out like a hand of cards. "You see, David, I know what you've been doing. And so does the CEO." His smile faltered. Just for a moment, but it was enough. He reached for the folder, flipping through the pages. His fingers hesitated on the invoices, the fake vendor payments. I watched his jaw tighten, the blood draining from his face. "Where did you get this?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been busy," I said, my own voice steady. "And I'm not the only one who knows. Sarah, Mark. Half the people in this office. You didn't just erase me, David. You made everyone complicit." He snapped the folder shut, his eyes cold and calculating. "You think you can threaten me? With this, who's going to believe you, Alex? You're a disgruntled employee. They'll think you're just bitter." I leaned forward, my hands flat on his desk. "You're right. If it was just me, maybe no one would. But I'm not alone, and I didn't come here for your approval. I came to tell you that I've already sent this to the CEO, to the board, to every client you lied to." His face went pale. You did what?" I straightened up, my heart thundering. "I sent it all. The emails, the financial records, the proof that you were siphoning money out of the agency, using my projects to cover your tracks." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "You've just ruined everything, Alex. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I felt a surge of anger and triumph, my voice shaking with it. "No, David, you ruined everything. You took what wasn't yours, and you thought no one would ever stand up to you." But I'm done being quiet. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us charged and electric. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out, my steps steady and sure. I could feel every eye in the office on me, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't the same person who'd walked out of here, in shame and confusion. I was done being erased. As I reached the lobby, I saw the CEO coming through the doors. His face was serious, his eyes scanning the room, until they landed on me. He gave me a small nod, a silent understanding passing between us. "Alex," he said quietly, "come with me." I followed him to a conference room, my heart still racing. The room was full, the board members, a few senior managers, even some of the investors I'd only seen in passing. My hands trembled slightly as I laid the folder on the table, opening it so everyone could see. "This," I said, my voice clear and steady, "is what David's been doing behind your backs. And this," I added, glancing around the room, "is how he's been using people like me to cover it up." The room was dead silent. I could see the shock on their faces, the disbelief turning to anger as they scanned the pages. The CEO looked at me, his expression hard but not unkind. "Thank you, Alex," he said finally. "We'll handle it from here." I nodded, feeling a rush of relief and exhaustion wash over me. It wasn't over, I knew that. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. As I walked out of that room, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. My story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and this time, I was going to make sure I wrote every word of it myself. The fallout was swift and merciless. By the next morning, the agency was buzzing with rumors and half-truths that couldn't hide the real story anymore. David's name was everywhere, whispered in hushed tones around water coolers, dissected in tense conversations in conference rooms, but the truth was out in the open now, and there was no putting it back. The CEO called an emergency meeting. Pulling the team together in the main conference room, David tried to talk his way out of it, but the evidence was too damning. His confident, smug demeanor crumbled under the weight of the truth, as he stumbled over excuses and half-lies. I watched the faces of my colleagues shift from confusion to disgust. They saw him for what he really was. It wasn't just the agency. Word spread quickly to our biggest clients, those deals he'd tried to rewrite history around. I heard later that a few of them dropped us on the spot, refusing to work with a company that had been built on lies and theft. The investors were livid. Legal action was already underway, and David's name was suddenly toxic in every corner of the industry he thought he owned. I didn't feel joy watching it happen. It wasn't triumph that filled me as I watched him escorted out of the building, his face pale and shell-shocked. It was something more complicated, a bittersweet mixture of relief and sorrow. I'd spent years believing in this place, in the people I worked beside. Seeing it all come apart was like watching a house burn that I'd once called home. But there was also a sense of justice, a quiet, steady assurance that I'd done the right thing. My voice had been silenced for too long. Now, it was the one that finally shattered the lies. In the days that followed, the agency began to rebuild. The CEO reached out to me personally, offering me a chance to return to help steer things back on course. I thought about it long and hard. Part of me wanted to go back, to reclaim what had been stolen from me. But another part knew that chapter was closed. I'd already written my final lines in that story. I walked past the building a week later, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. My reflection in the glass doors was different now, older, wiser, maybe a little worn around the edges, but there was something else there too, a spark of quiet strength that hadn't been there before. I knew I'd never forget what they'd done. The anger and hurt would fade. But the lesson wouldn't. I'd learned that my worth wasn't defined by a title or a paycheck. It was in my voice, my choices, and my refusal to be erased. As I turned away from that building for the last time, I felt a sense of closure settling in my chest. I had faced them, and I had won. The rest of the story was mine to write. In the weeks that followed, I found myself adjusting to a new kind of quiet. The constant hum of deadlines, and the weight of always having to prove myself were gone. In their place was a wide-open space, terrifying at first, but quickly becoming a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I took long walks through the city in the early mornings. When the world was still soft and half awake, it felt like I was relearning how to breathe, how to just exist without the constant pressure of someone else's expectations. Each sunrise reminded me that the world was bigger than the office walls. I'd been trapped behind for so long, I started freelancing, taking on smaller projects that let me stretch my creativity without the weight of someone else's agenda. There was something liberating in working on my own terms, in seeing my name on every proposal and pitch. Each project felt like a chance to reclaim a piece of myself. I kept in touch with Sarah and Mark, the people who'd stood beside me when everything came crashing down. We'd meet for coffee or drinks after work, swapping stories about our new paths and the quiet victories that came from refusing to be silenced. They reminded me that even in the worst betrayals, there are still people who believe in you. Some nights, the old anger would flare up, memories of David's dismissive smirk, of the way he'd tried to erase me. But those feelings didn't own me anymore. They were just echoes of a life I'd outgrown. And every time they surfaced, I reminded myself that I'd faced them. I'd stood up, not just for myself, but for every invisible worker who'd been told they were replaceable. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since college. At first it felt strange, like I was talking to a stranger on the page. But slowly, the words became a mirror, showing me how far I'd come. I wrote about the betrayal, the fear, the anger, and I wrote about the quiet hope that had grown in its place. There was a day, a few months later, when I was sitting at a small cafe near my apartment. My laptop was open in front of me, a fresh project underway. I paused, just for a moment, and looked around at the bustling street outside. People moving forward with their lives. The world alive and full of possibilities. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward. I was no longer the person who would lose themselves in someone else's story. I had found my own voice, and it was stronger, clearer, and more resilient than I'd ever known. I learned that sometimes, the hardest thing isn't fighting back, it's letting go of the need to prove yourself to people who never cared to see your worth. It's finding peace in knowing that your value doesn't need validation from someone else. I still don't know exactly where this new path will take me, but I know one thing for sure: I'm not replaceable. I'm not disposable. And I'm never going to let anyone make me feel that way again. As I closed my laptop and stepped out into the bright afternoon, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. My past was behind me, but it had shaped me into someone I was proud of, someone who knew the cost of betrayal, but also the power of standing tall. I walked away from that cafe with my head high, the city alive around me. I didn't have all the answers, but I had myself. And for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that betrayal doesn't always announce itself with a knife in the back. Sometimes, it's a slow erosion of trust, a quiet rewriting of your story until you're nothing but a footnote in someone else's success. But in that silence, I found my own voice. In their attempts to erase me, I discovered the power of refusing to be forgotten. The journey wasn't easy. It was painful and messy, filled with nights where doubt clawed at my heart and days where I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But every step forward was a testament to something stronger than fear, a quiet resilience that no one could take away. I learned that justice doesn't always come in the form of a courtroom verdict or a headline. Sometimes, it's the simple, stubborn act of standing up and saying, "I see what you're doing, and I won't let you win." It's the courage to expose the truth, even when your voice shakes. It's the decision to keep going, even when the path is uncertain. I know now that true strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about what you do after you've been broken. It's the choice to rebuild, piece by piece, with a clearer vision of who you are and what you're worth. It's the willingness to walk away from the things that no longer serve you, no matter how familiar or comfortable they once were. As I move forward, I carry with me not just the scars of what was lost, but the quiet wisdom of what was gained. I know now that my worth isn't measured by a title or a paycheck, but by the integrity I bring to every choice I make, and that's something no one can take from me. So if you ever find yourself standing where I once stood, feeling small, replaceable, erased, remember this: you are never truly replaceable. You are the only version of you that exists, and that alone is priceless. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I walk forward with my head held high, knowing that my story is mine to tell. And in the end, that's the only story that matters.